Welcome, everybody, to the Creative Bias Podcast. It's your host, Steve Bonner, and
Darla Millie.
thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about how learnable a skill creativity is, so stick with us. All right.
Hello.
Hello. It's been too long. It's been a minute, as they say.
Yeah, I took a little break.
Yeah, a
Holiday.
little bit of a hiatus. We've been busy. We've been busy saving the world
Yep, we've been
from...
busy.
That's
Blessed.
right. That's right. Booked and busy. What's been going on with you? Anything you want to share with the class, Darla?
Just enjoying the weekend. I mean, cherry blossom season's always a good time in New York City.
Love a cherry blossom.
Spring is here.
Uh, Spring has sprung, as they say. We had not we. I was going to say we had Easter here today. It wasn't like a us thing. It was. I think
Yeah.
it's global. Globally, they do Easter today,
Mhm.
and we don't celebrate um, religious stuff, but we like an excuse to eat candy, or at least my daughter does.
There you go, peeps.
That's right, peeps. Indeed, were enjoyed this morning. But we went to brunch, and I have never been served so much food as I was served at brunch this morning. It was absurd. So if I'm
Oh,
a little bit slow or I fall asleep during the middle of this recording, you'll know why.
understood.
Well, I'll tell you, I've been thinking a lot about the topic that we're going to talk about today on this episode lately, because as I said, we've been busy. We've been working with a bunch of different clients under the Creative Bias banner.
Mhm.
Um, and one of those engagements has really kind of stuck with me. And I can't talk about who the client was, and I'm not going to name names for obvious reasons, but I will tell you that this has happened on more than one occasion with me where we use a diagnostic at the beginning of all of our engagements. It's called the VIA survey. VIA is values in action. And what VIA does is it helps sort of assess the strengths of a team. And it's things like teamwork and leadership and creativity and curiosity and perseverance and zest. My favorite one is zest. And we'll talk
Mhm.
about zest later, maybe. You're familiar with VIA. I think you've taken that survey before, right?
Yeah, we actually it was part of my curriculum at school.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I took it once, like, in the middle of my corporate career the first time, and then I took it again when I was, like, at the beginning of school, and it was a very different scoring
Yes.
experience, but the thing I love about it is, I mean, it's rooted in positive psychology,
Yep.
because it is the one evaluation that, unlike most traditional psychological evaluations, kind of focus on trauma or what's wrong with you or your
Right.
weaknesses to, like, help improve them, where the point of this is to identify your strengths to build off of your strengths to compensate for whatever weaknesses you might have imbalanced. So
Absolutely.
that's an awesome way, I think, to approach everything, like,
Yeah.
in on
And
what you can do.
right, and I think that, it's sort of like part of the creative bias proposition that we
Mhm.
don't come into things, um, like assuming that things are broken or we have to fix things or we wanna poke at problems between team members or whatever. We instead come in and say, "How do we help the team? How do we help the individuals on the team do the best work that they've ever done? How do we help them tap into potential that they didn't know they had had?" And so I think VIA helps do that because to your point, it doesn't start from like, okay, let's point out your weaknesses. It starts from
Right.
a point of let's point out your strengths. Um, and so as I've spent quite a bit of time over the last couple of months, like going through people's VIA results. What
Mm.
struck me as interesting on two separate occasions was that teams that were very high functioning teams actually scored um, below average for creativity.
Mm.
And sort of the natural question that comes out of that, I think, is okay, so what do you do if that's the case? Like, if your team doesn't score well for creativity and they don't perceive themselves as being a highly creative team, can you make that team more creative? Can you make that team more innovative without swapping out people? And so that's what I want to talk about today. And I'm just interested in your experience working with teams, especially in agencies and on client side. What's been your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question to pose, and I think I just, cause coaching, I, in my head, immediately turned it into kind of an open-ended question where I was thinking about how can you make a team that doesn't think it's creative more creative? How, I think, is more the question.
I agree with that. And because what we do at Creative Bias is help, among other things, help
Mhm.
teams tap into creativity that might be left sort of latent. And there has been a ton of study into the how. And so there's this one tranche. Is it a tranche? It's a tranche of research that came out of Drexel University, where they actually studied this with jazz pianists.
Yeah.
And they took two groups of jazz pianists and they said, play solos over this chord progression and be as creative as possible.
Okay.
And there was a noticeable difference in performance between the two groups of people. Do you want to guess how the two groups of people were divided?
Repeat the repeat
Mm.
the assignment?
So there's a population of jazz piano players.
Right, yes.
They were segmented, and you could say they were segmented by tall versus short musicians, or men versus women, or children versus adults.
Okay.
And none of those are the distinction. But
Right,
what
right,
do
right.
you think the variation was between the two groups? Like, what was the distinction between the two groups?
Ones who believe they're musicians and ones who don't?
Sorta.
Okay.
Okay. One was a group of younger musicians, less established, let's say. And the other
Mhm.
was a group of highly established musicians. And the less established ones, when told to be as creative as possible, were more creative and more successfully creative than the more established musicians. And
Mm,
the hypothesis for why is that when you're more established and you identify as a creative person or as a musician or whatever, you've created your own schemas of what's right and what's wrong. And so if you have people who have less permanent, less rigid schemas of who they are as musicians, and then you ask them to be creative, they'll take more chances and they won't be afraid to fail as much and they won't trip over their attempt to be creative. So I think
right.
that's very interesting because if you take a team of people who define themselves as creatives in business and go, do the most creative thing you can think of, and then you take a bunch of people who don't necessarily identify as creatives, the creative group believe that there is an expectation either that they have for themselves or that other people have for them, and they're trying to live up to that definition of creativity. We kind of talked
Right.
about this in previous episodes. Like creative people should and do have their own signature shit. And so it's like, well, I always think in games or whatever. We talked about that in another episode.
Right.
But I think this is like when you don't have that rigid belief of who you are, maybe that can help you be more creative. So maybe the team that doesn't identify as creative is actually more capable of growing to be more innovative successfully than someone who's like, no, I'm a creative person. This is how I do things.
Right. Yeah, I think that actually really ties back to I think one of our conversations in the podcast that made me think of this was, when we talked about the first album someone drops versus
Yes.
once they've been a seasoned artist
Right.
and just doesn't hit the same because there's less rules the
Totally.
first time. You're growing into it. You're
Hmm.
not following a template that you've built, basically.
That's right. That's right. And when you've built the template for yourself, it's harder to like deviate from that because you become attached to your template because it means something to you.
Sure, sure.
There's another school of thought on like the how or a bit of research that has been done. And some of this was done at your alma mater, Columbia,
Okay.
that basically says people think about creativity wrong. And I agree with this wholeheartedly because they think about creativity as a personality trait. They go, oh, that guy's creative.
Mhm, mhm.
And especially in business, I would argue, um, creativity is more of a functional process than a personality trait. So you can put together a template that helps people, be more creative. You
Mm,
could say, "Okay, how do you think, um, Ryan Reynolds would solve this problem? How do you think Ryan Gosling would solve this problem? How do you think, uh, Taylor Swift would solve this problem? How do you
yeah,
think"
comes back to her, right?
it always comes back to Taylor. "Cardi B, how would she solve this problem?"
Yeah.
And when you create processes, and that's just a, like a kind of a silly example, but when you create processes meant to foster creativity and give people assignments, people who get intimidated by the free formness of creativity
Mm,
actually have steps to follow and actually have a map or like a path that they can follow into being creative and innovative. And I think that you should take heart in that, because if you have a team, if you run a business, you go, well, I don't have the most creative group over here, but you can tell them what you're looking for. You can ask them how people who aren't them might solve the problem. Just turn their imaginations on differently, and that can really help people be more creative. So, looking at creativity not as a personality trait, but as something that can be turned into a functional process, I think has a lot of value in it. Um, I would imagine, like, in your agency background, you've seen examples of this, but is there anything that, like, comes to mind? Not to
yeah,
put you on the spot.
I was actually just thinking it's almost, and I thought this might happen, uh, in the way that
Okay.
we responded to this question. I think I understand the inclination to go, like, the Aristotle route
Mhm.
sometimes, especially in organizations, and on teams,
When you say the Aristotle route, tell me what you mean.
like logic, function,
Yes.
like, make it make sense
Mhm.
versus what I was talking about earlier with the emotional intelligence and what we're
Yep.
looking at in the VIA character assessment, which is more of intuition, your
Mhm.
feeling, following your instincts, and that plays a role in problem solving
Yep.
all the time, like, in your everyday life.
Yep.
So I think it's striking a balance between the functionality of process, but to build because every just like every person works differently and just like every creative is motivated by different things, so is your team.
Yep.
And if there
100%.
it's a group of people, now you have to understand what motivates them so that you can get them to create things that motivates your audience, because
Mhm.
them understanding how they work will then mirror outside into the real world to create things that makes people feel things so
Yep.
that they can sell them or consume them or
Mhm.
whatever.
Totally. And I think that's you said something that makes me think, that kinda triggered this thought, which is, I think a lot of times in business, people think of creativity as the province of marketers. Like, "Oh, we gotta do advertising. The advertising has to be creative." And that's
Mm,
true, I guess, but creativity manifests in so many other ways in business. Like, for instance, I was talking to somebody recently who, uh, they sell they sell beverages,
okay,
and they were like, "We can't get our," essentially their sales team to care about one channel that would make a lot of sense for them to sell their beverages in.
okay,
I was like, "Okay, well, why can't you get them to care?" "Well, because they think it's too hard. They think it's gonna be too hard, too much work, and not worth it." And I was like, "Okay, so maybe you just need to frame your argument differently. And maybe your argument needs to be around, like, what is the downside, but what's the upside? And then turn it into a math equation where you go, the upside is more than worth the potential downside." And
sure,
that is an exercise in creativity, in framing an argument so that you can do the right thing for your business. And
sure,
so I feel like that's where the thing about creativity comes in. It's like people go, "Oh, I'm not creative," but they do stuff like that all the time. They shape arguments all the time, and that requires creativity. And so I think it's like it's not just about making art or copy or clever taglines or fun brand experiences or whatever. It's about the totality of your business
mm,
and how you apply creativity to the totality of your business, whether it's your supply chain, whether it's your financial strategy, whether it's your legal approach, whether it's your approach to risk, whether it's approach to team building, whatever it is, whether it's your approach to like designing the culture of your team, can involve creativity. So I think that's all very important. And I'm glad you
Mm.
said that because it made me think.
Well, what you just said, I think, again, is like case in point. It all boils down to your beliefs. If
Mm-hmm.
the team belief system is this is gonna be hard, it's not gonna work, that's what's gonna
Mm-hmm.
fucking happen.
Right. Right.
Um, it's just like in life, like, it's like, "This is really hard, I can't do this." Well, not with that attitude, bitch. You're not gonna do
Mm-hmm.
it. But, like
Mm-hmm.
and I think but on the, like, softer side of that, right, I think it's a big, a popular quote in coaching, at least, or in our school that we went to with Lumia,
Uh-huh.
a quote by Anais Nin, "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are," and
Mm-hmm.
that is also true and applicable to this because if your team, whether it's true or not, believes that something can't be done or they won't be good at it or it will not be successful or they don't know how, to your point and what you were just talking about, it's incumbent upon leadership to reframe that and get them to believe what is true or get them to see what is true
Mm-hmm.
versus what they think is true based on past experiences or
Yep.
whatever.
Yep. I also think there's a uh third bit of research um, that talks about outside in approach to creativity. So instead of like the idea has to come from me or the idea has to come from my team, um, ideas often come from networks. And when I say that, what I mean is like your network is the people that you know that you turn to for advice. One of the things that I've started doing, and you know this, but when I talk to teams, one of the questions I ask them is, "What's your beacon?" And what I mean by that is like when the path is not clear, when you're not sure what to do, what's your first instinct? Where do you turn? And for some people, it's intuition, and for some people, it's data, and for some people, it's the people around us. And I think the people around us is a really interesting one, especially when it comes to creativity, because if you're in any kind of business, I don't care what kind of business it is, you work with other people who are also in the business that you're in, who have also seen the problems that you are dealing with. And they might have ideas, or they might even have examples that like, they didn't come up with an idea, but they've seen someone else come up with an idea and solve the problem. And I think too many times in business, when people are brainstorming or trying to come up with ideas, they try to, or they feel like they have to be self reliant or self sufficient instead of
Mm,
like, no, I'm going to talk to everyone I know who might be able to help inform the ideas
abs
that I'm going to use to solve this problem.
right.
And so I think that's number 3. So I think, like, to just summarize that, if you're asking, "My team isn't very creative. Do I just need to fire them and get all a bunch of new people?" The answer is
Mm.
no. Don't do that.
Nope.
And then so if the next question is, "Okay, well, then how do I get them to be more innovative, more creative?" It's don't look at creativity as a trait, look at it as a process.
Yeah.
Don't constrain your perspective to the sort of circle of your team, be as expansive as you possibly can. And then the third one is just like give your team permission to experiment and especially give that permission to the people who are like maybe less established in their ways of working and their ways of doing things. And I think that that is good advice for any team that is struggling with like how do we become more innovative. Okay, guys, thanks for joining us on this episode of Creative Bias. We look forward to seeing you the next time. We try and upload every other week. We've been a little bit tardy lately, but we're going to get better, I promise.
Getting there.
Please follow, subscribe to the podcast, and we'll see y'all next time.
Bye.